Hey folks, George here. This time we're going to wrap up our discussion of the moral issue regarding the death penalty with Hugo Adam Bedau's article, Capital Punishment and Social Defense. Bedau, of course, is going to argue that the deterrence argument is not strong enough to maintain the death penalty, and therefore the death penalty shall not be used. Bedau starts his article by acknowledging, of course, it's not morally wrong to use violence in order to prevent greater violence or aggression. Right now, that's a classic utilitarian sort of argument. We could only sacrifice and do wrongs if it prevents greater wrongs for the greater happiness principle, right? After all, self-interest legitimizes self-defense, and it legitimizes the defense of others too. However, there are two assumptions that we have to acknowledge in all this. Number one is acting in self-defense is innocent. The second assumption is that there is no alternative to self-defense. Here's the problem. In real life, those two assumptions are frequently wrong. There is, after all, frequently escape as an alternative. You can frequently just run away. Therefore, violence in self-defense is, according to Bedau, not frequently justified unless you must defend yourself using violence. If you can escape, then using violence for self-defense is actually wrong, according to Bedau. So, how much violence is ever allowed? He gives a great quote: "No more violence than is necessary to prevent the aggressive assault. Violence beyond that is unnecessary and therefore unjustified." This is interesting because Bedau goes on to say that sometimes excessive violence in the name of self-defense is excused, even if it's not justified. So this is interesting to me because there's an interesting distinction between excusing something versus justifying something. Sometimes we excuse excessive self-defense because perhaps the person didn't know better, for example. That doesn't justify the excessive self-defense, though. Bedau points out, deadly force is never justified unless there's an immediate threat to an innocent person. There's two moral principles that we have to follow regarding violence. Number one, you have to perform violence against a guilty party. And number two, again, you must not have a better alternative. So with that in mind, now let's talk about criminal punishment. Punishment is the prevention of crimes by incapacitation and by deterrence. The death penalty certainly incapacitates people by killing them, right? Here's the problem for Bedau. The death penalty isn't the only way to incapacitate. That is, there are alternatives to the death penalty, right? So for Bedau, the key question is, for any utilitarian, does the death penalty actually deter? Here's where Bedau is a little bit humble. The evidence is really hard. By the way, last time, Vaughn acknowledged the exact same thing. Evidence is really hard to come by here. After all, regarding recidivism is that when criminals are released from prison, they go back and do the crime again. Convicted murderers have a similar record of recidivism as other criminals. Certainly, Bedau has to admit, some murderers will come out of prison and murder again, but we can't be sure which ones will. Here's Bedau's point. In so many other aspects of life, we allow in our society so many deadly risks. Driving is a terribly deadly risk. Alcohol use is a terribly deadly risk. Smoking tobacco is a terribly deadly risk that we allow. Why do we allow such deadly risks? Because we've agreed as a society that the total abolition of such is too great a threat against personal individual freedom. Now let's talk about the death penalty. How does all of this factor into the death penalty? Well, let's talk about death penalty and deterrence. Deterrence for murder is not measurably greater than the deterrence of long-term imprisonment. So, going back to his key principle here, unless there is a good reason for choosing a more severe punishment, the less severe penalty is to be preferred. Any responsible utilitarian analysis needs to carefully weigh the costs and benefits of all, including the cost to personal freedom. Now, frequently some people argue that the death penalty is way more expensive than life imprisonment. Bedau is a little bit suspicious, let's say, of such arguments. After all, this is very difficult to determine, and it would need to show, if you really want to prove this point, we would really need to show that abolition of the death penalty would be much less costly. It seems to me that if there were no death penalty, there'd be just as many appeals and back and forths in the legal system that would cost a similar amount of money. That's just a hunch after all. But since we don't know how much it would cost in a death penalty-free society, we can't determine how much it would cost to abolish the death penalty. So that's why Bedau doesn't weigh that argument quite so much. But what if the death penalty really did deter murders in society? Here's where Bedau is brilliant, I think, as a utilitarian. He really shows that utilitarians are not absolutists about any moral issue, especially the death penalty. And Bedau himself isn't an absolutist regarding the death penalty. What he's saying is, well, if we could prove that the death penalty deters, as a utilitarian, he'd have to be for the death penalty. However, the important point is, we don't know. There would be so many other costs to factor in and weigh, like, for example, wrongful executions. The great unanswered question is, for utilitarians, does this really deter? But that's the point for Bedau. It is an unanswered question, right? Some agree that it would be a reasonable trade-off. But since there isn't complete information, these questions can't be answered at this time. Therefore, we can't really rely on data regarding social defense, like deterrence. We can't rely on that data. Therefore, is there an alternative? Yes, life imprisonment. As a good utilitarian, we don't know how to determine if murders would go down. The data is just so terribly complicated. Because it's so complicated, that's an argument against doing something so terrible and vicious, like killing other people, especially since there's a reasonable alternative, namely life in prison. That's the summary of Bedau's key points against the death penalty. See you next time. Bye-bye.